The music died inside St. James's Palace as Princess Anne marched past security, slamming a military-grade flash drive onto the state table. King Charles was seconds from signing a massive constitutional transition when his sister stopped the pen mid-air. Within moments, the Privy Council office triggered an emergency lockdown, plunging the room into absolute silence. Anne hadn't just disrupted a ceremony. She brought unvetted evidence that completely paralyzed the sovereign's plan. The hidden ledger of the king's regiment. A single silver tea tray rattled on the long walnut table inside the military headquarters at Gatcombe Park. Princess Anne sat upright in her leather chair, her thumb pressing down firmly on a heavy plastic binder marked with the crest of the Royal Logistics Corps. It was a foggy Thursday afternoon in late 2026. On the desk lay a modern encryption terminal, its screen glowing with an active, unvetted data stream from the Defense Ministry's central repository. The binder contained a 12-page logistical audit tracking the private vehicle and supply allocations for the King's Guard regiments. The names of specific commercial leasing companies appeared in the margins, accompanied by financial codes that did not align with the standard defense budget allocations. In reality, the phrasing hidden in the back pages described a massive, unauthorized asset repositioning project that bypassed the standard oversight committees of Parliament entirely. The baseline facts of military property management within the household are governed by centuries of strict constitutional precedent. Under the Crown Estate Act, 1961, all physical properties and assets utilized by the military branches must be explicitly registered with the Treasury to ensure public funds are never mixed with the sovereign's private wealth. This boundary prevents the monarchy from operating an independent financial network within the armed forces. But the ledger Anne was reading proved that a parallel system had been quietly established over the past 18 months. The tension within the Gatcombe office spiked when an automated security alert lit up the terminal screen. The local network card immediately disconnected from the mainframe, showing a red flashing icon that indicated an external administrative block. The communication links to the main logistics depot at Aldershot Garrison were completely frozen. Someone in London had detected the princess's specific data search and had initiated a total network lockdown from the central terminal. Anne didn't pick up the office phone to call the IT department. She knew a standard administrative inquiry would simply alert the senior courtiers at Buckingham Palace that she had discovered the parallel records. She stood up from her desk, walked across the room, and pulled a physical master backup drive from a small, wall-mounted steel safe behind her grandfather's portrait. The mystery of the sudden digital freeze was resolved within 10 minutes. A physical log check revealed that the network block had been initiated directly from the personal office of the keeper of the Privy Purse. The authority code used to execute the lockout belonged to a senior accountant who answered exclusively to the king's private financial trustees. The palace had actively attempted to blindfold the Princess Royal while she was conducting a routine military property review. But the network immediately exposed a far more dangerous institutional problem. The hidden ledger didn't just track trucks and storage facilities. The final page listed a sequence of secret bank transfers originating from a private duchy fund, moving directly into the accounts of an offshore holding firm registered in the Cayman Islands. The transfers had been explicitly labeled as emergency funding for specialized military transport units stationed near the capital. The destination of that money remained an absolute secret from both Parliament and the heir to the throne. The official defense log showed no records of these specific transactions, meaning the king had used private crown wealth to directly fund a specialized security cell without the knowledge or approval of the Ministry of Defense. The institution was operating a secret security shield entirely outside the boundaries of the state apparatus. Anne's team at Gatcombe immediately realized the legal vulnerability this document represented. Under the current transparency laws, if a senior royal discovered a financial violation within a military unit under their command, they were legally obligated to report it to the parliamentary committee within 24 hours. Failure to do so would make the princess an accessory to an unauthorized distribution of crown resources. The princess ordered her personal car to be readied for an immediate departure to London. She did not file a travel manifest with the Royal Protection Command, nor did she notify her brother's scheduling office. She took the physical master backup drive, locked it inside her leather briefcase, and instructed her driver to head directly towards St. James's Palace, where the king was scheduled to sign an upcoming Regency transition charter. The reality of the situation was pressing heavily on the senior military staff, who remained loyal to traditional protocols. If the king had established an independent, privately funded logistics cell within the regiments, the entire legal chain of command was fractured. The military owes its allegiance to the crown through parliament, not through private corporate entities controlled by the personal estate of the monarch. Anne arrived at the western gate of the London Palace at precisely 3 in the afternoon. The rain was coming down in sheets bouncing off the old brick walls of the courtyard. The gate guards, recognizing her personal vehicle, raised the security barrier immediately, entirely unaware that the briefcase in the back seat contained the exact evidence needed to paralyze the upcoming state ceremony. She walked through the side gallery, her boots clicking sharply on the stone tiles. She didn't wait for a formal introduction or a staff escort. She marched straight toward the closed doors of the throne room, where the members of the Privy Council were already gathering around the long state table, preparing for a signing ceremony that was about to be completely derailed by an unvetted military ledger. The unvetted clause in the Regency Act. The gold-plated fountain pen remained suspended an inch above the parchment document on the center of the table. King Charles looked up, his hand freezing as the heavy oak doors of the throne room swung open. Princess Anne walked directly down the center aisle, her long coat dripping water onto the polished floorboards. She ignored the line of senior politicians flanking the walls and placed a physical printout of the military-grade data files on top of the state charter. The document sitting on the desk was a newly drafted amendment to the operational framework of the Crown Council. The text was intended to redistribute specific administrative responsibilities during the monarch's upcoming medical recess. Under standard public procedures, the palace stated that these adjustments were routine administrative updates designed to streamline day-to-day operations. In reality, the fine print contained a highly unusual alteration to the traditional chain of command. The constitutional facts of a royal recess are dictated by the Regency Act 1937. The law states that if a reigning sovereign is temporarily incapacitated, a panel of designated counselors of state must be formally appointed to execute official duties on behalf of the crown. This panel historically consists of the sovereign's spouse and the next 4 individuals in the line of succession, who are over the age of 21. This legal framework ensures that the executive power of the state remains fully transparent and balanced. The tension climbed when Anne pointed directly to line 22 of the new charter. The text contained an unvetted clause that explicitly granted a single, unnamed member of the private estate board the unilateral power to approve crown property reallocations, without the unanimous consent of the other councillors. This meant a private corporate employee would hold a veto power over decisions traditionally reserved exclusively for the royal family and Parliament. The Lord President of the Council, Lucy Fraser, leaned forward to inspect the specific wording under the table lamp. She called her legal advisor into the room immediately, bypassing the palace's internal staff. The senior politicians in the room realized they were seconds away from validating a document that fundamentally subverted a public statute of Parliament. How did this specific clause slip through the initial cabinet screening process without being flagged instantly? The drafting logs on the back page showed that the text had been inserted at 4 in the morning during a closed-door session at Clarence House. The digital signature authorizing the last-minute inclusion belonged to an outside constitutional consultant who had been hired directly by the king's personal estate trustees. Anne resolved this by using her tablet to display the consultant's private retainer agreement, which she had pulled from the Gatcombe military archives. The consultant had not acted independently. He had been paid a massive fee through the offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands. The palace's private financial trustees had deliberately manufactured this legal loophole to ensure they maintained control over the crown's private wealth during the transition period. But the loophole immediately opened a far more dangerous institutional problem. Anne flipped the printout to a secondary appendix dated 1999. This appendix contained a forgotten, highly confidential agreement signed by Queen Elizabeth II regarding the limits of private estate intervention in state affairs. The document clearly stated that any attempt to grant a non-royal entity veto power over crown assets would automatically invalidate the entire current Regency appointment charter. By forcing this clause into the modern document, the king's advisors had inadvertently triggered a historic legal trap. The The current signing ceremony was not just flawed, it was constitutionally invalid under the terms of the late Queen's private estate protocols. If Charles signed the document under these conditions, his entire temporary administration would be open to immediate legal challenges in the High Court. William's chief of staff, who was watching from the back row of the room, immediately picked up his secure radio link to contact his legal team at Kensington Palace. The balance of power inside the room had completely shattered within the span of 5 minutes, leaving the senior members of the cabinet to figure out how to withdraw the document without creating a public constitutional scandal. The king set his fountain pen back down on the silver stand and pushed his chair away from the table. He looked at his sister, then looked down at the physical printout of the offshore bank transfers. He did not defend the clause or argue with the legal findings. He knew that the presence of the military audit trail made any denial completely useless before the assembled council. The room remained absolutely silent except for the heavy rain beating against the high stained glass windows of the palace. The senior ministers began whispering in small huddles, refusing to touch the parchment paper until a full independent review of the drafting history could be completed by the Treasury solicitors. Anne picked up her leather briefcase, closed the tablet, and stood by the corner of the table, waiting for the formal postponement order to be issued. She had used her unique position within the military branches to unearth the exact evidence needed to block a systemic corporate takeover of the Crown's traditional authority, proving that the old world protocols still held the ultimate leverage over the modern palace apparatus. The underlying ledger logs also contain deep operational details from a separate Buckingham Palace finance unit. These logs recorded the movement of hundreds of thousands of pounds directly out of the sovereign's secondary reserve accounts during the spring of 2025. The destination of these specific capital outlays matched a series of private architectural firms currently conducting unvetted surveys on properties in Aberdeenshire. The Treasury representatives inside the throne room instantly demanded access to the corresponding digital tokens to verify these transactions. If the king was utilizing private crown capital to fund unapproved infrastructure projects while simultaneously modifying the Regency Council's legal limits, the Treasury was exposed to a massive compliance violation under the National Audit Act. The situation grew more critical when a text alert flashed across Lucy Fraser's secure government mobile. The Cabinet Office in Whitehall had just flagged an anomalous, unnotified statutory instrument that had been placed on the parliamentary order paper late the previous evening. The instrument was designed to fast-track the transfer of regional duchy land titles to private trusts, completely bypassing the standard public gallery debate. This revelation connected all the pieces of the puzzle. The unvetted clause in the Regency Charter was not an isolated error. It was the crown piece of a synchronized secret administrative project designed to secure the family's private property holdings from state auditing before the transition took place. Charles's private legal advisors had built a hidden highway through the state regulations. William's personal representative walked to the center of the room, standing beside Princess Anne. He formally stated that the Prince of Wales's office would withhold all signature approvals for the upcoming financial rotation bills until a full independent forensic audit of the Cayman transactions was delivered to the permanent secretary. The heir was officially freezing the Crown's operational liquidity. The king remained silent, his face pale against the dark wood of his high-backed chair. He gestured to his private secretary to remove the vellum parchment from the signing desk. The institutional mechanism had jammed completely, blocked not by an external political enemy, but by the meticulous recording of the Princess Royal and the decisive intervention of the future king. The room began to clear as the members of the Privy Council filed out through the side exits, their faces tight with anxiety. They left the parchment behind, its blank signature lines serving as a silent testament to a failed constitutional maneuver. The historical boundary between the state's public authority and the family's private wealth had held, but the trust at the center of the household had fractured completely. Anne walked back toward the gallery entrance, her boots making a steady sound on the dry carpet of the outer lobby. She had delivered the evidence, frozen the unvetted charter, and forced the entire administration to halt its secret transition plan. As she reached her waiting vehicle in the courtyard, the rain finally began to ease over London, leaving the palace apparatus to face the cold reality of an unresolved constitutional crisis. William's private briefing. The heavy velvet drapes of the West Gallery muffled the tense discussions echoing from the main throne room. Prince William stood with his back to the high glass window, his eyes fixed on a secure, military-grade encrypted laptop that sat open on a small gilt console table. It was exactly 4 in the afternoon. Beside him, his chief legal counsel, Jonathan Jones, was rapidly highlighting lines of digital text, scrolling across the encrypted screen. The data appearing on the display originated from the master copy of the Balmoral Castle registry files, which Princess Anne had forced into the open just minutes earlier. The records were not mere suggestions. They were cold, hard administrative entries detailing a hidden financial apparatus within the Duchy of Cornwall asset pool. The spreadsheets track specific capital transfers from 2025 that had been executed without the knowledge or signature of the prince's own financial trustees. The factual basis of the Prince of Wales's financial autonomy is legally anchored in the Duchy of Cornwall Management Act, 1863. This statutory framework mandates that the revenues and land holdings of the duchy are the exclusive personal property of the heir to the throne, designed to provide him with absolute financial independence from both Parliament and the reigning monarch. Under this law, the sovereign has zero constitutional right to interfere with, leverage, or redistribute duchy resources. Yet, the unvetted files proved a systematic bypass had occurred. The tension in the gallery became unbearable as Jonathan scrolled down to the legal definitions section of the digital file. He pointed to a hidden clause buried within a routine land exchange deed signed in London during the coronation adjustments of 2024. The clause contained an archaic, French phrase legal trigger known as an asset reversion waiver. This specific mechanism allowed the sovereign to quietly reclaim territorial mineral rights under the guise of an emergency military defense mandate. William's face went rigid as he read the clause. The palace trustees had used his own administrative signatures on standard property renewals to create a silent pipeline, pulling resources away from his estate to fund the unvetted logistics cells managed by the king's personal advisors. The institution had used the complexity of medieval property law to pick the pocket of the future monarch. The prince immediately demanded an absolute verification of the digital signatures. He wanted to know how a clause of this magnitude had been inserted into his estate papers, without his personal legal team flagging the text during the standard review cycles. The entire administrative apparatus of his office was suddenly under a cloud of deep suspicion. The hidden waiver was resolved within 12 minutes by a forensic software scan of the file's metadata. The digital logs revealed that the clause had not been part of the physical document reviewed by William's lawyers in London. It had been appended to the digital registry file 3 weeks after the physical signing, utilizing a master administrative override code that was held exclusively by the Lord Chancellor's private seal keeper, Sir John Dyson. The discovery that a high-ranking state official had facilitated the post-signing modification turned a family disagreement into a severe constitutional violation. The palace trustees had manipulated a public legal registry to alter the ownership of private land titles. This move violated multiple sections of the Land Registration Act 2002, exposing the king's private administration to a catastrophic legal challenge in the public courts. But the metadata tracking immediately opened an even more dangerous question regarding the upcoming regency transition. If the king's advisors were willing to alter existing land registries to secure funds, what had they inserted into the secret annexes of the current transition charter? William ordered his security team to lock the doors of the West Gallery, preventing any palace messengers from entering the space while he briefed his core team. He turned to his private secretary and gave a direct, unwavering command. He ordered an immediate total freeze on all communication links between the Duchy of Cornwall financial offices and the main treasury terminals at Buckingham Palace. There would be no further sharing of data, no routine transfers of capital, and no joint administrative meetings until Sir John Dyson was removed from his post and stripped of his digital security clearances. The private secretary expressed immediate concern about the public fallout of an open administrative war between the king and the heir. If the treasury terminals showed a total lockout of duchy data, the financial markets and the British press would realize within an hour that the core structure of the monarchy had fractured. The stability of the transition plan would be completely destroyed. William remained entirely unmoved by the warning. He stated clearly that he would not inherit a hollowed-out estate controlled by an unvetted corporate board sitting in the Cayman Islands. He picked up his secure mobile phone and dialed a direct, encrypted line to the Prime Minister at number 10 Downing Street, bypassing the standard palace protocol that required all prime ministerial communications to go through the King's private secretary first. The call was clinical and absolute. William informed the head of government that his office was officially withholding its consent for the upcoming Regency Council appointments. Under the current constitutional guidelines, the Prime Minister cannot present a Regency activation bill to Parliament if the next in line to the throne formally challenges the legal validity of the transition charter. The prince had just dropped a political anchor, halting the entire machinery of the state. Outside the gallery windows, the rain continued to pour over the gray slate roofs of London, washing away the last remnants of the afternoon light. Inside, the laptop screen continued to flash with new updates as Jonathan Jones compiled the forensic report for the Cabinet Office. The balance of leverage within the House of Windsor had completely inverted within a single hour, leaving the prince in absolute possession of the legal facts. William closed the laptop screen with a sharp snap and walked toward the gallery doors. He instructed his security detail to unlock the entrance and prepare his vehicle for a direct departure to his private residence. He had no intention of returning to the throne room to face his father or the assembled members of the Privy Council. He had delivered his ultimatum through the channels of property law and state authority, leaving the palace apparatus to figure out how to survive the silence he had just imposed. The confrontation with the Privy Council. The long mahogany table inside the main conference room of the Privy Council office was covered in printed copies of the disputed military ledger. King Charles sat at the far end of the room, beneath a large portrait of King Charles I, his hands resting on his silver cane. Around the perimeter of the room, 24 senior politicians and legal advisors stood in small, anxious clusters. Nobody sat down. The air inside the chamber was incredibly tight, thick with the scent of damp wool coats and old paper. The structure of this emergency meeting was dictated by the Privy Council Constitution, which dates back to the 14th century. Under British law, the Council serves as the sovereign's private advisory body, possessing unique legal powers to issue orders in council that carry the full weight of statutory legislation without requiring a full vote in the House of Commons. This powerful executive machinery is meant to handle state emergencies with absolute speed and absolute confidentiality. But on this rainy afternoon, the machinery had turned completely against its own creator. The tension in the chamber peaked as Princess Anne walked to the center of the floor, standing directly opposite her brother. She picked up a physical copy of the National Audit Act and opened it to Section 8. She stated clearly to the assembled ministers that the unvetted financial transfers from the Duchy of Lancaster directly into the offshore Cayman accounts violated 3 separate transparency directives that Parliament had passed in 2025. The Crown lawyers could no longer argue that these funds were entirely private. They had been used to modify active state logistics units. The Lord President of the Council, Lucy Fraser, took her seat at the center of the table and called the meeting to order. Her face was pale under the sharp fluorescent lights of the room. She looked down at the forensic report that William's legal team had compiled just 20 minutes earlier in the West Gallery. She looked at the king and stated that the Cabinet Office could not, under any circumstances, recommend that the Prime Minister present the Regency Transition Charter to Parliament, while these offshore transactions remained unresolved. The mystery of how the Council would handle a direct, legal freeze from the heir to the throne hung over the table. Under traditional constitutional guidelines, if the Prince of Wales withholds his consent for a Regency bill, the Council is legally required to suspend all transition procedures and refer the entire dispute to a special committee of the High Court of Justice. Such a referral would immediately drag the private financial arrangements of the royal family into a public courtroom, completely destroying the wall of absolute secrecy that the institution had maintained for generations. The Attorney General, who had been summoned to the room via a secure link from Whitehall, resolved this specific procedural mystery by delivering an absolute legal assessment. He stated that the presence of the post-signing digital modifications on the land deeds meant the current transition charter was legally contaminated. The document could not be fixed with a simple amendment or an administrative correction. The entire legal framework had to be torn up and rewritten from scratch, a process that would require a minimum of 6 weeks of intense, independent forensic accounting. But the procedural barrier immediately opened a far more dangerous political crisis inside the room. If the ceremony was officially halted and the charter withdrawn, the public would immediately realize that a massive structural fracture had occurred within the upper echelons of the palace. The senior ministers began arguing fiercely over the wording of the public press release, with some advising a total media blackout, and others warning that a sudden delay without explanation would trigger a massive panic in the financial markets. Charles remained entirely silent throughout the bitter debate, his face tight and unreadable under the gazes of his ministers. He looked down at his fountain pen, which still sat on the silver tray in the middle of the table, a useless piece of metal now that his executive authority had been thoroughly checked by his own sister. He realized that the parallel financial network his advisors had meticulously constructed over the past 18 months had collapsed within a single hour, pulled apart by the very military auditing protocols he had approved years earlier. Anne stood her ground by the table, refusing to leave the room until a formal, written postponement order was officially drafted and signed by the Lord President. She had accomplished exactly what she set out to do when she uncovered the hidden ledger at Gatcombe Park. She had blocked an unvetted corporate takeover of the Crown's traditional authority, ensuring that the historical boundary between the state's public funds and the family's private estates remained fully intact and balanced. The clock on the wall struck 5 in the evening, its deep chime echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Lucy Fraser picked up a clean sheet of official stationery, dipped her pen into the inkwell, and wrote out the formal declaration suspending the signing ceremony indefinitely. She signed her name at the bottom of the page, followed by the signatures of the 3 senior cabinet ministers present in the room, officially bringing the secret transition plan to a total, unmitigated halt. The advisors began packing their leather briefcases in absolute silence, avoiding any eye contact with the king as they filed out through the rear exits of the chamber. The confrontation was over, resolved not through public shouting or open political warfare, but through the clinical application of statutory law and historical precedent that left the traditional palace apparatus with absolutely no room to maneuver. Charles stood up from his chair, leaning heavily on his cane, and walked toward his private elevator without saying a single word to his remaining staff. The palace had fallen completely silent, a heavy, freezing stillness that signaled a permanent shift in internal leverage away from the monarch's private trustees and directly into the hands of Princess Anne and the future king. The ceremony is halted. The physical parchment of the Regency Transition Charter was lifted from the mahogany table by a low-ranking clerk wearing white cotton gloves. He slid the document back into a blue velvet folder, pulling the silk ribbons tight to secure it. The signing desk was completely bare. Outside the palace, the evening streetlights of central London were flicking on through the heavy mist. The immediate cancellation of the event triggered an automated security downgrade across the entire perimeter of St. James's Palace. The high-ranking diplomats and religious leaders who had been waiting in the adjacent Queen's Gallery were quietly directed toward the side exits by the master of the household. No official explanation was given to the guests. They were simply told that a technical scheduling conflict required a temporary postponement of the state business. The factual reality of this sudden halt was unprecedented in the modern history of the monarchy. Under the Public Records Act, all official decisions regarding the suspension of a Privy Council ceremony must be formally logged in the Crown Office ledger within 1 hour of the event. The entry for this afternoon recorded the postponement under Code 44, a specific legal designation reserved for unresolved constitutional discrepancies involving the royal prerogative. The tension shifted from the conference room down into the underground security bunker beneath the palace courtyard. The digital terminals managed by the Metropolitan Police Royalty Protection Command began receiving a series of high-level administrative revocations. The electronic security clearances that allowed the king's personal estate lawyers to enter the private archives at Windsor Castle were being systematically deactivated from an external source. Princess Anne walked down the concrete corridor of the lower level, accompanied by the Treasury Solicitor, Sir Jonathan Stevens. She was holding the physical backup drive containing the unvetted military logs. She did not return the files to the palace registry. She was heading toward an independent transport vehicle that had been dispatched directly by the High Court's Administrative Division, where these disputed files would be stored to prevent an internal palace deletion hung over the legal teams. Under standard protocols, any document introduced during a Privy Council dispute is automatically absorbed into the royal archives at Windsor Castle. If that happened, the king's private financial trustees would regain legal possession of the evidence, allowing them to potentially classify or destroy the ledger sheets under the guise of national security exemptions. Sir Jonathan resolved this by producing a physical preservation order signed by the Master of the Rolls under the Tribunals, Courts and Enforcement Act 2007. This order explicitly designated a secure, bomb-proof basement vault beneath the Rolls building in central London as the temporary legal repository for the evidence. The files were being placed entirely outside the geographic and legal jurisdiction of the royal household, under the direct protection of the civilian judiciary. But the physical removal of the documents opened a far more complex structural problem for the future administration of the crown. By moving the evidence to a civilian court vault, the internal financial operations of the offshore Cayman accounts were now vulnerable to an independent judicial review. If a single judge decided that the parallel logistics network violated public spending laws, the entire private income stream of the sovereign could be subject to an emergency parliamentary freeze. William's legal team at Kensington Palace immediately initiated a second phase of their defensive strategy. They sent a formal private memorandum to the Cabinet Office demanding a total restructuring of the Crown's Private Asset Management Board before any new Regency text was presented to the politicians. The heir was using the leverage of the frozen ceremony to permanently strip his father's personal advisors of their administrative authority. The response from the king's inner circle was entirely fractured. The personal estate trustees realized their legal highway had been blocked at both ends. They could not use the Regency Charter to bypass Parliament, and they could not access the frozen duchy funds without triggering a full forensic audit by the Treasury solicitors. Their structural leverage had completely vanished in less than 2 hours. Outside in the courtyard, the rain had stopped, leaving the wet asphalt glistening under the security floodlights. A line of unmarked black sedans pulled up to the main gate to transport the senior members of the cabinet back to their offices in Whitehall. The politicians moved quickly, refusing to answer any questions from the single pool reporter who had been stationed near the outer barrier. Anne watched the vehicles depart from the window of the security lobby. She handed the master backup drive to the court courier, who locked it inside a steel transit case with a digital combination seal. The physical evidence of the secret parallel network was officially leaving the palace grounds, signaling a complete and unmitigated failure for the private legal team at Clarence House. The clock on the palace tower struck 6, its deep metallic note echoing over the empty streets of the capital. The institution had survived the immediate attempt to alter its constitutional boundaries, but the internal framework of trust had been completely destroyed. The family was left to face a silent, unresolved reality where the future king and the Princess Royal held the ultimate legal veto over the reigning monarch's private administration. The dramatic disruption at St. James's Palace has exposed a deep structural fracture within the modern monarchy. By unearthing the unvetted military files, Princess Anne has once again proven herself to be the ultimate protector of the crown's traditional constitutional boundaries.